Komið sæl og verið velkomin á síðasta hrafnaþingið á þessu ári. Má ég biðja ykkur hérna hinum einu í salnum að gefa hljóð og fá ykkur sæti. Já, fyrirlesturinn okkar í dag, fyrirlesturinn okkar heitir Pavel Vasovits, grasafræðingur og vinnur hjá Náttúrufræðistofnun á Akureyri. Við ætluðum raunar að hittast hérna fyrir viku en hann komst ekki vegna veðurófsan sem að gekk yfir landið þá. En hann sem sagt komin hingað í dag og ætlar að segja okkur frá niðurstöðum verkefni sem að hann hefur unnið að undanfarið sem að varðar aðfluttar plöntutegundir á norðurslóðum. Meðan hann talar þá gengur gestabókin eins og venjulega og ég bið ykkur að skrifa netfangi ykkar fyrir aftan nafnið ef þið viljið vera á postlistanum okkar og ef þið eru ekki nú þegar. En ég bið þið velkomin Pavel og gjör svo vel.
Good afternoon. So today I'm going to talk about the non-native plants, but not only in Iceland, as I was doing this in my previous lectures on hrafnaþing. But I will put this phenomenon of island plant migration and naturalization and invasion in the Arctic in a broader context. So today I'm going to speak about the advantages and disadvantages of the pre-existing sources of information on non-native plant species in the Arctic. Then we will try to answer the question, why do we need reliable information on non-native species? So what is the data for? Why we need this? What can be achieved when comprehensive data are available? And well, then I will show you the new data from the Arctic and I will try to discuss a way forward. What can be done as a next step? Well, maybe I will start with sort of a truism, but well, maybe it's good to realize that globally invasive alien species are among the most significant drivers of biodiversity loss, and in some ecosystems they are clearly the primary contributors to species endangerment and ecosystem degradation. And that's why so many people are interested in the biology and ecology of alien species, in particular invasive species and also invasive species. Until recently, we had only actually one source of data on the alien flora of Arctic, and the source was, of course, the annotated checklist of the Pan-Arctic flora. There was another paper published in Arctic Biodiversity Assessment Report, Chapter 9, Plants, and there was also of all non-native and non-native plants in the Arctic. That was a sort of addition to this chapter. And this Pan-Arctic flora approach, it has an advantage, well, because that was the only source of information on the Pan-Arctic scale until now. Well, but of course, Pan-Arctic flora had also a lot of disadvantages. First of all, the survey for non-native species was not comprehensive at all. Then the geographical criteria were just loosely applied. And well, they mentioned no invasive plant species in the Arctic, and of course they mentioned no information on pathways. And what is the pathway? Pathway is a road by which a non-native species is transferred from one ecosystem to another. So we can say that this is a physical mean by which a non-native species is transported to a new region by humans, either deliberately or accidentally. If we are able to identify the pathways of introduction and if we know the details of the vectors, then we have one of the most important types of information in the practical approach to the prevention and management of biological invasions. Because if we know pathways, we have all the necessary data to prevent the introduction of potentially invasive species, and also we are able to contain further spread of established invasions. Well, the work on pathways in the Nordic countries has been done in 2015. Maybe some of you have seen this small publication, Invasive Alien Species by Nobanis. And this is a pathway analysis and horizon scanning for countries in the Northern Europe. I was one of the co-authors of this small book. And then in 2014, there was a paper published identifying and ascribing the relative significance of introduction pathways of non-native species into Iceland. When and in this paper we can see really detailed analysis of pathways for plants was published, so we can the temporal development of different pathways and some patterns of activity during the last 1 century or so. Convention on biological diversity in Aichi Biodiversity Target 9 specifies that by 2020, invasive alien species and pathways has to be identified and prioritized, and the priority species should be controlled or eradicated, and measures should be in place to manage pathways to prevent their introductions and establishment. So with the relation to pathways, the target contains 3 elements. Well, first element is to identify the pathways of invasive alien species, then to prioritize pathways, and the third element is to manage pathways. A few years ago, I took part in the preparation of Arctic invasive alien species strategy and action plan. And the main problem we faced during this work was that we had no comprehensive data available. And well, when it comes to the alien flora of the Arctic, but there was no data at all on pathways, apart from some really fragmentary regional data that were available from some countries, like for example from Iceland. In 2018, the CAF Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program started preparing the first State of the Arctic Terrestrial Biodiversity Report. And well, we have to bear in mind that climate change and human activity now is opening the Arctic to many different species. And some of them may turn out to be invasive at the end. And in order to prevent, well, irreversible damage, we need to know the pathways, as well as dispersal agents, in order just to manage the invasive species coming to the Arctic in a right way. When the data on invasive alien species in the Arctic are available, then we can undertake some mapped actions, we can propose the actions, and the actions can be, of course, evaluated. So when this work on the first State of the Arctic Terrestrial Biodiversity Report started, I thought that it might be a good idea to try to summarize our knowledge on invasive alien plants in the Arctic. And to do that, well, we try to cooperate with different institutions from Canada, United States, Finland, well, from many countries that have some connections to the Arctic. And we started our scrutiny in order to deliver the first comprehensive data set on the Arctic invasive alien species. Well, the definition of the Arctic that we used followed the borders of the Circumpolar Arctic vegetation map. So the total investigated area was more than 5 million square kilometers. And we subdivided Arctic into 23 regions. And these 23 regions, they largely correspond to the floristic regions used by the Pan-Arctic Flora checklist by Reidar Elven. We made some minor changes, like for example that Iceland Jan Mayen, Svalbard, and Franz Josef Land. We treated these regions separately. Iceland and Jan Mayen in Pan-Arctic Flora checklist, it's a one region. Svalbard and Franz Josef Land, this is just a one region as well. And we decided to treat these regions separately due to the geographic isolation and, of course, huge differences in the composition of the non-native flora. We cannot compare Svalbard, for example, with Franz Josef Land. It doesn't fit together in terms of the non-native flora. To characterize the composition of the non-native flora, we consulted diverse data sources. Well, we of course looked at comprehensive databases of non-native species. We searched the non-native Plantcopedia, national and regional list of non-native plants published in scientific journals and books. Then we checked books and online Compedia of national and subnational floras with information on native plants. We also consulted the GBIF and major herbaria holding collections from the Arctic. Within each region, putative pathways of introduction of each taxon were identified, of course based on available evidence. It was not always possible to assign pathway for every single species in each region. Well, this evidence included personal observations, notes from herbarium specimens, and data available from local databases. And in our work, we used the pathways categorization accepted by the Convention of Biological Diversity. And this categorization, it consists of 6 major categories. This is a release in nature, escape from confinement, transport contaminant, transport stowaway, corridor, and unaided. As a result of our work, it took like 2 years to complete this search. We documented the presence of 341 non-native vascular plants in the Arctic. And the data are presented in a sort of a database that we can see here to the right. There are 188 taxa that are naturalized in at least one floristic region in the Arctic, and 153 that are casual in one or more region. And the total share of non-native taxa in the Arctic flora is, well, it's just 8.6%. So this is still very low number when we compare, for example, to the floras of the Europe, or even to the flora of Iceland. The 341 non-native taxa that have been recorded for the Arctic, they belong to 39 families and 180 genera. The greatest number for non-native plant taxa in the Arctic belong to Poaceae, so the grasses, Asteraceae, 48 species, and Brassicaceae, 45. And then the genera richest in non-native species are Rumex, it's 12 taxa, then Poa, Ranunculus, Trifolium, and Vicia. And Henopodium album was the most widespread non-native taxon in the Arctic, and it was recorded in 13 out of 23 regions that we investigated. Then the Henopodium was followed by Stellaria media, present in 11 regions, and Fallopia convolvulus that was present also in 11 regions. Now maybe some more details about the distribution. As we can see here, most non-native taxa, they have very limited distribution in the Arctic. And the number of taxa that are naturalized and the total number of taxa, they follow the same pattern. Majority of the taxa, they occur only in one or just a few regions. And here we have some how the species look like. Now we speak about the naturalized taxa, Stellaria media. As I said, it's present and naturalized in 10 regions. Then we have Henopodium album and Trifolium repens, naturalized in 9 regions, while Draba nemorosa and Puccinellia hauptiana, these are these 2 plants. Puccinellia hauptiana is a grass, Draba nemorosa belongs to Brassicaceae, are naturalized in 8 of the 23 investigated regions. Yes, then we can have a look on the taxonomic richness on non-native plants in the Arctic regions. Here we have a map showing the distribution of total non-native taxa. So here we have like a naturalized and casual species together. It's maybe worth noticing that there are 3 regions in the Arctic when we didn't record any non-native species, and this is the from Russian Arctic Anna Bar Oleniok, then we have Franz Josef Land, and then we have this Elsemer Land in northern Greenland. So even though we were trying hard to search for any records of non-native species, there are none. So these floras of these regions are still more or less without any sign of non-native taxa. Then I would like also to show you some discrepancies between the treatment of Pan-Arctic flora and our treatment. Then we can see, for example, in northern Iceland, Pan-Arctic flora lists 2 casual taxa, while we found the information about 62 casual taxa listed just in the northern Iceland, in this small, tiny little bit of northern Iceland. Then we have taxonomic richness of non-native plants in the Arctic. Now we speak about the naturalized taxa. And as we can see, also these 3 regions are free of non-native taxa, while the naturalization, well, the pattern is much more complex. Here we can see that the western part of Russian Arctic is quite rich in naturalized taxa, and Kanin Pechora, this the westernmost region in Russia, is the richest in the plant taxa that already has been naturalized. And again, Pan-Arctic flora lists 52 species from this region, while we found evidence for 120 species. So this is a huge difference, and that has been well evidenced here. Then the invasive species. I would like to remind you that the Pan-Arctic flora, according to Pan-Arctic flora, there are no invasive species in the Arctic as defined by us. While of course it doesn't take a genius to know that both invasive species, invasive plants in Iceland are present within this Arctic bit, and there are more invasive species present in Alaska, especially here in the eastern part of northern Alaska. There are 8 species that were recorded by us, and they are invasive. What about Iceland? Of course, there is Lupinus utcatensis present here in the northernmost bit of the Tröllaskagi Peninsula. Of course, Lupinus is also present and very widespread close to Húsavík, and Triscus sylvestris. This is also the northernmost part of the Tröllaskagi Peninsula, and as we can see here, it's plenty of it growing and invading the abandoned fields. But what about the other species? So apart from Antriscus and Lupinus utcatensis, we also recorded Bromus inermis, Caragana arborescens. That is the only well, it's not the only one, but this is a shrubby species. Then we have Cirsium arvense, Hordeum jubatum, Leucanthemum vulgare, Linaria vulgaris, Merilotus arbus, Prunus padus. This is a tree, already invasive in northern Alaska, and Vitia cracca. Well, to see how the Arctic regions are interconnected in terms of the alien flora, we use the hierarchical clustering and multidimensional scaling just to see if we can discern some groups of regions, and it's very clear that the alien flora of the Arctic can be subdivided into 2 major parts. So the European and Northern American bit. This is the blue part of the map, and then we have the Asiatic or Russian region or a couple of regions. This is the red part here. Well, can we say anything more? Yes, well, we also checked the number of non-native taxa per each kilometer square. So we wanted to see how the number of non-native taxa can be compared with the size of the territory. And here Iceland is prominently the best in this comparison. Here is Iceland. It's NE because it's Northern Iceland. We're using this NE instead of IS. Then it's followed by Jan Mayen. But well, there are just 2 species that are present in Jan Mayen that are not non-native. Then we have the Northern Fennoscandia and Svalbard. It's here. Here is Kanin Pechora, and this is one of the regions from the far east Russia. But by far, when we take these data into account, then we can see that the Icelandic, Northern Iceland is by far the most impacted by the presence of non-native species. Now, maybe a few words about pathways. As expected, it's not easy sometimes to find out what is the pathway of each organism that is coming, and that's why the percent of unknown that ended up in the unknown category, it's quite high, both for total non-native taxa and also for naturalized taxa, but it's quite low for invasive, because normally invasive species are quite well researched. Then we can see that in terms of invasive species, then escape from confinement is the highest. It's almost 50% for all the interactions. Then the transport is quite high, while, for example, release plays just a very, very little role in the importation of non-native species to the Arctic. Then let's check some subcategories. We have three shades of gray here. So the light one, it's all species. Then this one is naturalized species, and the dark one are invasive species. So we have agriculture that plays quite an important role in the Arctic context. Horticulture, that is the most significant in terms of importation of invasive species. Synth contaminant, very active pathways for naturalized species. Transport with machinery and equipment, very active pathways for invasive species. And people and their luggage, in particular tourism, it's also very, very active, but not yet maybe for invasive species, but still for the species that is coming and going. So for the casual species. And also vehicles like train, car, and so on and so forth. So all this information can be found, and I think even more than that, can be found in the recent paper that describes the research we undertook. And it will be published, it's already available online, but it will be published formally in the special issue of Ambio early next year. Now maybe a few words about the way forward. So we delivered an evidence-based comprehensive list of non-native plants in all the Arctic regions, and it's supplemented with information on the most active pathways of the interaction. So now it seems to us that this research creates a background for informed decisions that can be made on pathways control that can be tailored for each region and its specific flora. And it seems that next step could be a preparation of environmental impact classification for the alien taxa for each Arctic region, if possible, of course. As I said before, the Aichi Target 9 says that all invasive alien species and pathways should be identified by 2020, and more or less the same obligation came from the Sustainable Development Goal of the United Nations that says that by 2020 we should introduce measures to prevent the introduction and significantly reduce the impact of invasive alien species on land and water ecosystems, and control or eradicate the priority species. And to achieve this, in 2016, the IUCN World Conservation Congress issued a resolution towards an IUCN standard classification of the impact of invasive alien species. So this is the resolution, and maybe a few words about this about the standard classification. So this is a simple, objective, and transparent assessment process that classifies the alien species into 5 major categories, according, of course, to the magnitude of the detrimental impacts to the environment. And this classification, ACAT, it has like 5 major objectives. First objective is to identify taxa that have different levels of environmental impact. Then the second objective is to facilitate comparisons of the level of impact by alien taxa among the regions and taxonomic groups. Then to facilitate the predictions of potential future impacts of taxa in the target regions and elsewhere. 8, the prioritization of management actions, and 8, in evaluation of management methods. Well, of course, it must be stressed that this classification is not a risk assessment. It's also not a statutory list of harmful invasive species and should not be used on its own, just to identify which alien taxa species should be regulated or not. This system that I'm talking to, it's that was developed by IUCN. It's a standardized protocol that can be applied to this assessment, and it's analogous and draws heavily upon the framework adapted for classification of the globally recognized IUCN Red List of threatened species. And here we have the categories. So there are different categories. There are species that are not evaluated. Then we have species with no alien populations, species with unsatisfactory data, and then we have the impact categories that are minimal concern, minor concern, and then harmful species with moderate, major, and massive impact on the environment. Well, for me, it's at least here locally in Iceland, this is a project that we could potentially start to try to categorize our invasive alien species according to this scheme proposed by IUCN. Thank you very much.
Þakka kærlega fyrir.
Takk.
Áhugavert efni. Við höfum fínan tíma fyrir umræður. Pavel skilur alveg íslensku, þannig að þið megi alveg bera upp spurningarnar á íslensku.
Thank you, Pavel, for a very interesting talk. Is there any nation that has initiated this classification of alien species according to the slides you just displayed?
You mean according to this?
Yes.
Well, this is still a proposed classification, but they were some. Well, I think it's in some countries it's in process. Yeah, so we won't be the first one. And there are some publications showing how it works and so on and so forth. But as you can see, this is still a proposed standard classification. This is the version from July 2019. So this is really the newest proposal from IUCN, how we can try to categorize invasive alien species.
Einhverjir fleiri sem vilja taka til máls?
Invasive species, can you refresh my memory? Was it only in Iceland or there were other places also that had invasive species?
In the Arctic?
Yeah, in the Arctic.
No, it was not in Iceland and Alaska.
And Alaska, yeah.
Yes, and Alaska. And I'm sure that there are invasive species in Russia.
Yeah.
But we are just lacking the data to prove this.
Yeah.
Because there are such a high numbers of already naturalized species that I just don't believe that there are non-species that are invasive there. But of course we had to rely on the data we had, and the data from Russia, they were not so complete. I would say gently, but well.
I was also to follow up on this.
But still, it's a big progress comparing with what we had before, because you could see that in this region, Canin Pechora, there were 50 species according to the Panarctic flora and 150 species according to us, with the evidence for each species. Because our paper is evidence based, so we always need to have a herbarium specimen or a really trusted literature record in order to put a species on a list.
I was just wondering the area east of Taimyr. There were no non-native species. It's probably due to lack of data.
It's always this is also an area that is there is very few inhabitants there. This is the area of more or less just a tundra there, and just a few villages.
Which have some villages.
Yeah.
I've been there.
Yeah. But it's also difficult to get the data from there. Even though we were searching and quite well for the Russian part of the Arctic, we also had a quite reliable data from the publications from 2018-19 in some regions. So this is not so hopeless, but most of these publications are available just in Russian. But we had a colleague who is Russian, and he was able to get this data for us.
Sigurður Þórðarsson, why did we only take the north of Iceland and not all of Iceland?
Because there are different definitions of the Arctic, what is Arctic and what is not Arctic. And we decided to adopt one particular definition of Arctic, and this definition is based on the vegetation. So if there is a Arctic vegetation, then we say it's an Arctic. And according to the Arctic vegetation map, that is like mapping all the vegetation in the Arctic, only this northernmost bit of Iceland can be identified as a truly Arctic, while the rest of the Iceland can be identified as subarctic. Well, so that's the reason. But of course, you have all kinds of different definitions of the Arctic. There is a climatic definition of the Arctic that says, for example, that the Arctic is where the mean temperature of July is below 10 degrees, and then the most of the Iceland is Arctic, actually, according to this definition. But we had to adopt some definitions, so we decided to do this that way. Yeah.
Thank you, Pavel.
Yeah.
It was interesting. Do you think the high number of invasive and native plants here in Iceland compared to this, what you showed us, do you think it is because we are on this border of being Arctic, or is it some other explanation?
I think that it is not only being the border, because when you compare, for example, Iceland with, I just want to go back to the map to show you some very interesting thing. Here we have naturalized species, and please take a look on the northern Fennoscandia. This is also quite inhabited area as for Arctic conditions, but still very few species could be found there. Even though we were trying, this is area that is well known. There is a lot of botanists going there, and still just a very small number of invasive alien species have been recorded in this part of. Sorry. This is so this is a huge difference comparing to Iceland, and I think Iceland, it's we had just a lot of species that are spreading mainly from agriculture, from horticulture, and that's the main problem, I think, here. Yeah. Yes.
It's so interesting. I could think of two explanations for why Iceland has so many non-native species. It's First of all, there's a lot of transport or pathways, as you call it, to Iceland. I think more than maybe to other
to the northern Fennoscandia, yeah.
And then the size of the flora, the native flora, maybe it's so small. So
yes, but here we compare to the per kilometer square.
Okay.
So it hasn't. The size of native flora hasn't got any. There is no.
The species pool, if you like.
Yeah. But here here is the number for the area. It's not the percent of the flora.
Yeah. But if you look at it as a percentage of.
Then it's much higher because exactly. our flora is much more poor.
That's what I say.
Yes.
That could be a
yes, but not in this comparison.
No. Exactly. And I think it is something to look into.
Yeah.
Ykkur fleiri sem að vilja taka til máls? Ef ekki, þá bara þakka ykkur fyrir komin og þakka þér, Pavel, fyrir fyrirlesturinn.
Já, takk.
Óska ykkur gleðilegra jóla og við sjáumst 15. janúar fyrsta hrafnaþing á nýja ári.
Takk fyrir komuna.